And it came down to, you know, basically overnight, the Marvin Miller and Ray Grebe, who Miller obviously with the Players Association, Ray Grebe representing the owners, agreed to a deal for everything except for free agent compensation, and that was the elephant in the room. And they agreed to just basically table that and say, hey, we're going to put a committee together. We're going to decide what we want to do and look into this further, but we're going to continue to play in 1980. And even at the time, people said, I think it was a quote from Jerry Royce that said, you know, this is just kicking the can down the road. We're not going to get this fixed. And, you know, and then that's exactly what led to the strike in 81, that single issue. And so really that, like I said, that strike should have taken place in 1980. And again, how would history have been different? You know, I mean, the other part of that is when you start to look at in 1982, once that labor contract was in place, all of a sudden you saw a lot more movement. Guys started, you know, teams were hesitant to sign guys because they didn't know exactly, this was pre-collusion, but they didn't know what the financial structure of the game was going to look like. So they were hesitant to give out big deals to people. And then heading into 82, you start to see guys moving around more. Reggie goes to Anaheim, and, you know, there's a lot of other player movement. So that all played into everything that took place that year.
Yeah. Yeah, it's every baseball player today probably doesn't even know who Marvin Miller is, but they owe everything to him because he's one of those
Absolutely.
people that fought. And, you know, I mean, that, you know, you think of before the free agency, my goodness, I mean, they were basically like, you know, that's it. You belong to a team, and that was it. You could forget about being moved anywhere.
Yeah, you could forget about being moved anywhere. You lived in the neighborhood with the fans. You took the subway to that. You had a job in the off season because you had to. You know, I mean, Richie Hebner famously was a grave digger, and you know, I mean, I don't know that he necessarily had to do that. I think his family owned the cemetery, but you know, that was guys certainly are not taking jobs working in sporting goods stores selling insurance in the off season now like they were back in those days. So
Funny you
again, just a
mentioned
different
that.
time.
Funny you mentioned that. As a kid, my parents had a store, like a flower shop, and Bob Robertson of the Pirates
Yeah.
came, and he was selling insurance. This was like in the mid '80s, and he came up to me and shook my hand and said, "Hi, I'm Bob Robertson. I played for the Pirates from '71 to '79 or something like that." And I'm like, "Yeah, whatever." Oh, I think he said he said something like, I think he played first base or something like that. I'm like, come on, that was really Stargell. I mean, I didn't tell him that, but it's like I didn't
Right.
believe he was a player. And so, yeah, that, you know, yeah, they had other jobs, but um, one of the one of the crazier people in not just in 1980 but in baseball history was Joe Charbonneau of the Indians. I believe he won Rookie of the Year, but he got stabbed in Mexico in the beginning of the of earlier in the year.
Yeah. Just an amazing story. They had a spring training exhibition, couple games down in Mexico, and he and a couple of his teammates were standing outside a hotel, and a guy came up and asked him where he was from, and he said California, and this guy just stabbed him. And they wrestled him to the ground. It's interesting when I read some of the things said that he was stabbed with a pen. Some said he was stabbed with a pen knife. Um, I find it hard to believe he was necessarily stabbed with a pen, but yeah, just a crazy, crazy story. And then, you know, basically it turned out that this guy hated Americans, and so he just came up and stabbed him, and he was fined, I don't remember what, 250 pesos, which turned out to be what, 50 cents or something like that
Yeah.
by the Mexican government. And so, yeah, but obviously Joe was okay. And then, I mean, and again, that's another one, kind of a what if story where Charbonneau had an amazing year in '79, but it was in Double A. He had kind of a checkered past with the Phillies. And then Andre Thornton hurt his knee in spring training, and so the Indians needed bodies, and so they moved Mike Hargrove from the outfield to first base and put Charbonneau in left field, and I think he was in left field, and you know, and he started to hit well, and all of a sudden became a cult hero, and you know, won Rookie of the Year. He's still beloved in Cleveland. I mean, he's still the man up there. He still lives up there.
crazy. He would dye his hair. Um, he opened beer bottles with his eyelid, I think, or something.
Yeah, his eye socket. Yeah, I mean, he used to fight. He used to participate in bare knuckle boxing matches in boxcars for money when he was a teenager. Yeah, so he just had a very, very interesting story, and just a very colorful guy. And I think, I talked about in the book about how I think it was Fidrich in Detroit, Charbonneau in Cleveland, and then the next year Fernando in L.A. are guys who just become kind of synonymous with these cities and take these cities by storm for whatever reason. And it's, I mean, obviously, well, it wasn't too tough to figure out why Fernando took L.A. by storm, but guys like Joe Charbonneau and Fidrich had basically one good year, and people still love them, people still talk about them. And so I think there's a romance about that as well. That's just, call it a flash in the pan, if you will, but these guys that surface, bubble up for 1 year and then kind of go away, but everyone still talks about them. I mean, Mark Fidrich won, I think, 29 games in his career, and were he still alive, he would never pay for a drink in Detroit. People just love it.
Yeah. The Indians were in the AL East at the time, but they were also in a division with they were okay. So the Indians finished 79 and 81, which was only sixth place out of 7 in the AL East. But the big race in the AL East was the Yankees and the Orioles. The Orioles were in the World Series the year before. This is before the wild card. They won 100 games and still didn't make the playoffs.
Yeah, really a crazy, crazy season. And, of course, I mean, another guy that comes out of nowhere, Steve Stone, wins, 24, 25 games and wins the Cy Young Award that year. And it cost him basically the rest of his career. He was out of baseball by 82. But I think, I've heard quotes that say that he'd make that trade again, and I don't know of many people that wouldn't make that trade to have that one great season. But, yeah, I mean, the Orioles – that was an incredibly talented team. I mean, that was pre-Cal. Cal was in, I think, Double-A in 1980 because he came up in 82. But I mean, there was still obviously a lot of talent on that team. Again, the Orioles, so very, very good pitching. And, yeah, like you said, they won 100 games and didn't even make the playoffs, which is, criminal to think of, especially now. I mean, there's no way that's happening now. It's rare for a team to win 100 games period now, let alone to not make the playoffs. So
yeah, I mean, it's only slightly better now. Now the Orioles would be playing who knows who in a 1-game playoff, which is I guess better than nothing. But that's the Pirates, one of the few times they were good about 5 years ago, they ended up in those 1-game playoffs, those wild cards, and didn't fare so well. So
that's rough.
Yeah, it is rough. But so the Yankees did win that division, and one really cool thing about 1980 is 3 of the 4 divisions came down to the last week of the season, which is really cool. But the Yankees, I always laugh at the Yankees in the 80s because when I think of the Yankees in the 80s, I think of George Steinbrenner, and he was such a larger-than-life figure and had so much influence over it, good and bad. But at least in 1980, it all came together pretty well, winning 103 games.
Yeah, I mean, that was a really interesting Yankees team. Reggie hit 300 for the only time in his career. Rudy May led the league in ERA. Gossage led the league in saves. Reggie tied for the league lead in home runs. I mean, that's pretty much one of Reggie's best years. I mean, I think in any other year, Reggie probably wins the MVP, but when a guy hits 390 and leads his team to the World Series, it's a little tough to take the MVP away from him. But again, to your point, George Steinbrenner was very much George. I mean, there was one point where, he was criticizing Dick Hauser and saying, well, our guys knew and he'll get it. I mean, Dick Hauser had been in baseball for 25 or 30 years at that point, and George Steinbrenner was just a rich shipbuilder who'd been in baseball for 6 or 7 years at that point. Yeah. And he's telling, Dick Hauser what to do. So,
And ultimately, Hauser, had a choice of either fire one of his coaches or quit. And to his credit, said, "Screw you, I'm out of here." And he left after 1 year. I mean, he leads the team to the playoffs, wins 103 games, and then he was gone because he didn't want to put up with George. So George was he was quite the tyrant back in those days. He was mellow. He became the grandfatherly Seinfeld kind of guy at the end, but he was not. He was quite the tyrant back in those days.
And I'm not sure after Hauser was gone if Billy Martin came back. He had this wonderful on again, off again
Exactly
thing with Billy Martin. I think it was before what was it, around this season they almost got Billy Martin before 1980, but then he changed his mind because he got into a fight with the guy.
Yeah.
And Billy Martin
Billy was the manager in '79, and then he ended up getting into a fight with of all things, a marshmallow salesman in a bar in Minneapolis in October. And so George had to cut him loose. And again, so there's that whole aspect of it. Then there's the whole thing. So Billy goes to the A's in 1980, but the only reason that Billy goes to the A's is because Charlie Finley had a deal in place to sell the A's to an oil baron in Denver, and he was going to move the A's from Oakland to Denver, but then that deal fell apart. And so then Charlie Finley said, well, okay, if I want to try to sell this team, then they can't be as crappy as they've been. And so he hired Billy Martin a week before spring training started. I mean, Can you imagine that today, hiring a manager a week before camp opens? And then Billy comes in and, institutes Billy Ball, and they start running everywhere, and he wore all those pitchers out. They threw 94 complete games that year. Which is, crazy to think about. I mean, obviously unheard of. Rick Langford threw 23 complete games in a row. And even the guy that led the team in saves threw a complete game at the end of the year. So
probably just to get innings in.
Exactly. Yeah. Because Billy part of it was that, Billy had no faith in his bullpen. But the other, and they had good starters, although Brian Kingman was one of the guys who threw a lot of those complete games, and he lost 20 games that year. So, but they had three different guys throw 14 inning CGs that year. But then, again, that was Ricky's first full season in the league, so they were running an awful lot. They were certainly an exciting team and fun to watch. And then Billy ended up getting fired, I think, after 81. Billy took them to the playoffs in 81, and then went back to New York for a stint 3 or 4 and 5 or however many it was. I kind of tend to lose track of those things.
God, Ricky Henderson was such a beast in the 80s.
Oh, yeah,
absolutely. Stolen
absolutely.
bases. Oh my goodness, just him and Vince Coleman just
and Reigns. Don't forget about Tim Reigns too.
Yeah. I'm still angry about the Expos that they were robbed in '94.
Yes.
Talk about another strike, and it just, baseball never became anything there. And it's like, I wish they would bring baseball back to Montreal, because they got robbed. Especially, those teams were loaded. Oh my goodness.
They really
talk
were.
About something. But in the A's were in the AL West. They finished second, but finishing first and eventually going to the World Series is the Kansas City Royals. And their big player was George Brett, who almost hit 400.
Yeah, just a phenomenal season. And when you go back and look at his game by games, there was a game in May where he went 0 for 6. And I think at that point he was hitting 261, something like that. And from that point forward, he hit 430 or something like that. It was just crazy. And one of the most amazing things to me too is he got hot right after that game in May, and hit 450, 500, something like that for about 15 or 20 games, and then he got hurt. He tore ligaments in his ankle trying to steal a base, of all things, in Cleveland. And he missed a month of the season, entire month. It was June 10th. He came back on July 10th, right after the All-Star game, and just did not miss a beat. And I can't imagine missing a month in the regular season. Aside from the physical part of it, it's just got to jack up your timing, but not if you're George Brett. And he just continued to hit like crazy. And So he hit 390 that year. Rod Carew had come the closest, hit 388 in 77, I think it was. But Carew